come from 40 different countries. They're all vying for over $150,000 in prize money. The format Mercadian masked block constructed. Survive New York City and you are on your way to the World Championships in Brussels, Belgium later this year. First prize of this event is worth $25,000. The runner-up takes home $15,000. Third prize is $10,000, and fourth place gets $8,000. Sigurd Eskelin advanced to the top 8 and then defeated fellow Scandinavian Matthias Cattell in one semifinal, while Warren Marsh upset heavily favored Ben Rubin in the other. Eskelin and Marsh will now go head-to-head. Here's Randy Buehler and Brian Hacker to explain the decks.
A blue enchantment card called Rising Waters is the key to Eskelin's deck. His spells are very defensive in nature. Eventually, he uses his creatures to win the game, but their real purpose is to stall the game until he draws this crucial enchantment and to maintain control of the game once he does.
Warren Marsh's deck is much more aggressive. His goal is to swarm his opponent with a horde of rebels as quickly as possible. His spells were chosen because they can clear a path through the opponent's defenses. Almost half the competitors in this Pro Tour ran a variant of Marsh's deck.
Rising Waters versus the Rebel deck has been the defining matchup of the event. Both players think they have the better deck and the advantage in this matchup. Now, Eskelin and Marsh square off to decide things once and for all.
Game 1 should be exciting. Remember, the object of the game is to reduce your opponent's score from 20 to 0. There you get a good look at Eskelin's opening hand. He's pausing, he's thinking about it, thinking about whether or not to cash it in for a new hand of 7. How good was that hand?
The hand was fine. It just seems like Sigurd's probably doing a little bit of gamesmanship. He wants to kind of, make Warren think, okay, my hand's not so good, blah, 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 when his hand's actually just fine.
That's what I thought, too. Marsh is elected also to keep his draw. He's got a couple of lands, got some rebels. Eskelin draws the third land. That was the only thing missing from his draw. Eskelin's draw is actually quite good right now. He's got the Rising Waters, which is the key to this matchup. Rising Waters is an enchantment that says both players are only allowed to untap 1 land per turn. The Rebel deck is a very powerful deck, but it uses an extremely mana-intensive engine. It has to use all of its mana every turn. So if it only gets 1 mana per turn, it basically can't implement its strategy. And Sigurd has Rising Waters in his hand, which is exactly his big weapon. So this turn, Sigurd's going to tap his mana to put Eye of Ramos into play, I expect. Eye of Ramos is an artifact that can be tapped for mana, so even though Rising Water says you can only untap 1 land per turn, you get to untap all your artifacts and all your creatures. Because he has Eye of Ramos, Eskelin will have access to more than 1 mana. He gets 2 mana a turn, and if he plays the second Eye from his hand, he'll have 3 mana a turn while his opponent only gets 1. Gives him an enormous advantage and allows him to cast all the spells he wants to while his opponent's pretty much, it's almost like his opponent's in prison. Oh, but there's Seal of Cleansing. Now what's going to happen?
Well, this was unfortunate for Eskelin. He really was hoping that that Warren Marsh would, if he had any kind of disenchant type card, it would be specifically disenchant. Mainly because once he puts Rising Waters in play, he wants to cast Thwart then. Now he has to cast Thwart this turn, which hurts, because it sets him back a couple turns in terms of land and mana development.
Yeah, Thwart allows him to say no to that Seal of Cleansing, but he had to pick up all 3 of his islands in order to do that. Now it's going to take him a couple turns to build back up to enough mana to actually cast the Rising Waters.
However, it was a necessary play, so I think,
absolutely.
Yeah.
You can't let Seal of Cleansing hit the table.
That's right.
Seal of Cleansing could destroy Rising Waters, and then his whole plan falls apart. Marsh has bought himself some time. We'll be right back to find out if he can capitalize on it. I'm here with Brian Hacker, and we're watching Game 1 of the Pro Tour New York Championship match between Sigurd Eskelin and Warren Marsh.
Despite Eskelin's early thwart, he's starting to rebuild his position. He's got both eyes in play and a Rising Waters in hand. It's hard to tell if that will be enough, but things are definitely looking up for him. He's hoping to take control of the board over the next 2 turns.
Now here you see how the Rebel deck works. You can use Rebels to go get other Rebels out of your deck. They recruit more Rebels into your army, and if you get to use your mana every turn to just bring more and more and more creatures into play, eventually you have an enormous swarm of creatures that it makes it pretty easy to kill your opponent. But the key part of that is you have to be able to use all your mana every turn to do that recruiting.
The consistency of the Rebel deck has been the reason why it's been such a popular choice this weekend, and also why it's had the success it's had. The fact that it has so many searchers means that every game you're going to draw at least one searcher in order to get more rebels on the table, and that in turn will get the other rebels that you're looking for.
Players here are both veterans to the Pro Tour. They've both been around for a number of tours, but neither of them has really burst onto the scene in a big way. Neither of them had made it to the final 8 of any major tournament, any Pro Tour, until this one right here. Eskelin had a couple top 16s. Marsh actually has 4 top 32s. So they've been around, but this is the first time either of them's got the chance to play on stage, under the lights, with all the pressure. I don't know that either of them will be rattled, since they have been around tour, but it feels a little different when you're on stage under the spotlight.
No doubt about that. Sigurd Eskelund is definitely a player of diverse caliber. A lot of people consider him one of the greatest limited players in the game. It's a little surprising that his first top 8 should come in a constructed event, but because this constructed event has the field of a lot of limited events, then it stands to reason that Sigurd Eskelund should do well. He has done well. He's basically been very dominant with the Rising Waters deck through the tournament. This is the match he's been able to win consistently.
Yeah, he's actually only lost one match all weekend. He had a couple matches that became draws, but he's only lost once all weekend. Now, that was to a Rebel deck, but he's beaten the Rebel deck 4 times. The Marsh has started recruiting some pretty big Rebels onto his side. Ramosian Sky Marshals, a 3/3 fire. He can definitely do some damage.
15.
But Eskelin's basically willing to take some damage in order to play Rising Waters with the ability to defend it.
This strategy of Eskelund's is so powerful. The combination of a lot of cards to control an opponent's mana, like Rising Waters, and bounce in the form of seals and Waterfront Bouncer. This has been a very strong combination. Once you get Rising Waters in play, by bouncing...
Oh, there's Counterspell. There's Counterspell, and Marsh is tapped out for that Joval Queen. Marsh tapped all his mana to cast an enormous creature, but he's going to regret having all that land tapped when Rising Waters hits the table. Here it comes. Marsh nods. Yep. All right. It's not good for me. Got anything else? Eskelin says, I think I've done enough. So now Marsh will only get to untap 1 land per turn.
And this is the game that Eskelin really wants to play. He wants to try to control the mana development of the Rebel deck by playing Waters. And in addition, once he has a Bouncer working every turn, which he'll pretty much have because he's drawing a lot of superfluous cards, like just islands and things of that nature, he can use those to put back in Warren Marsh's hands cards like Ramosian Sky Marshal, Joval Queen, that won't be able to hit the table anymore.
Yeah, Eskelin's going to be able to attack. It's going to take some damage. Marsh is able to attack for a few turns, but over the course of the next couple turns, what you'll see is Eskelin returning all of Marsh's creatures to Marsh's hand, and since Marsh doesn't have any lands, he only gets 1 per turn, it's going to be almost impossible for Marsh to get his creatures back down onto the table.
Eskelin did indeed bounce all of Marsh's creatures back into Marsh's hand. With Counterspell in hand backing him up the whole way, Eskelin slowly dealt 20 points of damage with his Drake Hatchlings and Stinging Barriers and took a 1-0 lead in his best 3 out of 5 match. Now let's meet the man the Pro Tour players call the Big Viking.
I've always been interested in games in general. Games like Monopoly and all kinds of games. I'm definitely a competitive person. I like to compete. I played a control style deck named Rising Waters, which is a blue deck. It wins by locking down the opponents and controlling all his resources so that you finally win after a long game. The thing I like most about Magic is the fact that it's a strategic game where you get to use your mind, both your creativity to create a deck and also your mathematical skills. Pro Tour is a bunch of good people and a lot of friends hanging out, playing a game that we all love, and getting paid for it when we do well. That's the Pro Tour for me.
Trip to Brussels, Belgium. for the 2000 Magic the Gathering World Championships in August. Before we move on, let's bring you up to speed. Game 2 was very similar to Game 1. Eskelin used Rising Waters to deny Marsh the use of most of his lands and locked up the game early. With Eskelin up 2-0, things looked grim for Warren Marsh. However, in Game 3, he was able to recruit an enormous swarm of rebels into play. Even though Eskelin was eventually able to play Rising Waters, it was too late. Now let's learn more about Warren Marsh.
I really enjoyed the traveling aspects of playing Magic. Now, the best thing about it is actually getting here, meeting people, and swapping deck ideas. Initially, when we're preparing for the block constructed format, we have an overview of all the cards and just analyze them on how good you think each individual one is, on its pros and cons. And then we start looking at synergies and the number of good cards within that color. Then we see if we can make 2-color decks, and if we can find a good combo somewhere, then maybe have a look at that. In the meta game, you have to have a really good understanding about what's going on. If you don't know what everyone else is going to play, where can you start? If you know what people are going to play, you can say, well, let's try this deck. No, we know it beats that. It's got a good shot at that. Can we change it a little so it can beat the other deck?
Magic is played in more than 50 countries around the world. It's printed in 8 separate languages. Let's take this opportunity to explore the mystique surrounding this international phenomenon. Magic is a trading card game. The object is to reduce your opponent's score from 20 to 0. To do that, players send their creatures against each other in waves, always seeking a lapse in the defense or an opening to exploit. To get you up to speed, here are the 3 basic types of cards. Creature cards attack and damage the opposition, and they can be used to block attacks. Then you have spell cards, each with an effect on the game that helps you or hinders your opponent. Land cards are the resources. With more land in play, the creatures get bigger and the spells get more devastating. Magic requires planning, tactics, and the ability to think fast. They say you can learn how to play immediately, but mastering the game can take a lifetime. When we come back to Pro Tour New York, Game 4 of this best-of-5 match. Pro Tour New York. Right now, let's give you an update on what's happened so far in game number 4. Coming in up 2-1, Eskelin set up his Rising Waters lock early on, just like in the first 2 games, giving him the appearance of control. This time, however, Marsh has answered, using Seal of Cleansing to destroy Rising Waters and totally changing the complexion of his game. Marsh has played out his handful of creatures, forcing Eskelin to improvise. Let's rejoin Randy and Brian with the call.
Okay, what Eskelin appears to be doing now is flying over with the Drake Hatchling, then dropping the barrier and just win with the barriers that are on the board. Because Marsh is at a relatively low life total, Eskelin might be able to race him with the 2 barriers on the board and the 1 in his hand.
And a big decision he has to make now is whether or not to shoot twice with the Stinging Barriers he had, sacrificing both of his Eye of Ramos. This is a definite option he has because he doesn't have a Rising Waters in his hand, so he could conceivably think that this game is going to be played without Rising Waters, so why do I need my Eye of Ramoses? I can get 2 more damage with the Stinging Barriers. And actually, I think that's what Sigurd's thinking about.
Well, Marsh just decided to use 1 more of the Fade counters on Parallax Wave to remove 1 of the Stinging Barriers from play. And Eskelin does exactly what you suggested. He's going to sacrifice those artifact mana sources in order to get 1 more blue mana and deal a point of damage to Marsh.
Now, I've drafted with Eskelin many times, and this is why I like him, because when his back's really to the wall, the only thing he's thinking about is how can I just take Warren Marsh down? How can I just win? Screw all this controlling the game, slogging through the mud. Let's just see if I can just go over the top with this Drake Hatchling and a Stinging Barrier.
He has another Drake Hatchling in his hand now. Just drew another Drake Hatchling. He has a 3rd Stinging Barrier that he could potentially play this turn. Suddenly, this is not a Rising Waters deck anymore. This is blue beatdown. These aren't the biggest creatures in the world, but seem good enough. Eskelin plays out that additional flyer. Here comes another Stinging Barrier. How much damage can Warren Marsh do if he comes up with a Reverent Mantra? Just looks like 4 points of damage.
That's true, but I think he can. He could win the following turn. Let's see.
He'd have to Mantra twice.
Okay.
Well, he could just put out enough big creatures with Lynn Civvy
Sure.
and with the Lieutenant, I believe, to win.
Does he have a Reverent Mantra in his hand?
I don't believe so.
So Marsh has to play to win next turn. That has to be his plan. So he should use Lynn Civvy and use the Remosian Lieutenant to recruit some more rebels into play. Try to get enough such that if he draws Reverent Mantra off the top of his deck, he can cast it, hope Escalon hasn't drawn a permission spell, and he'll win. He's building up as many creatures as possible. I don't think he can swarm Escalon without Reverent Mantra. Escalon's deciding whether to kill a creature or to knock a point off Marsh's life total.
And a little bit of gamesmanship. Marsh is pointing
Wants
to
him to
his
kill the
sergeant.
creature.
Yeah, I think that's really what he'd prefer at this point. But you know
Escalon
what?
doesn't fall for it.
Escalon just goes right over the top. And that's what I love.
Escalon would really like to draw some counter magic. He drew Daze. Well, that's not a very effective counterspell. All you have to do to get out of it is pay 1 more mana. So I'm sure when Marsh casts Reverent Mantra, he'll have at least 1 mana left over, if Reverent Mantra's on top of his deck. Yep, it all comes down to what card's on top of Warren Marsh's deck. He hasn't drawn a Reverent Mantra yet.
Does Parallax Wave win it for him as well? Could he potentially clear off enough of the blockers to win with
Well,
a
the other Parallax Wave is going to go away at the beginning of his turn. So
that'll
those other
bring-
creatures come back into play. I don't think Parallax Wave is good enough. I think Parallax Wave might be enough. I don't think it wins the game immediately, but it puts Escalon in a bad position.
Actually, no, if he draws Parallax Wave, he'll win immediately.
You're right. Marsh needs to draw either Reverent Mantra or Parallax Wave next turn. Otherwise, Escalon may be able to outrace him. So Escalon is in position to win, but the game is certainly not over yet. Not everyone is surprised to see him sitting here on the brink of winning a Pro Tour. Let's hear what John Finkel, arguably the best player in the world, had to say before the Final 8 competitors were even determined.
Well, I think the person to look for in the top 8 right now is Sigurd Escalon. He's been around for a long time, and a lot of the players know he's a very good player, but he's never actually made top 8 in a major tournament. And I think that he has a very good deck, and who knows, he could easily walk away here the champion of the year.
John Finkel speaks from experience. He's the top player in the world. Here's a look at some of our other leading money winners. And we'll be right back.
We're in Game 4 of this battle pitting Sigurd Escalon and his Rising Waters deck against Warren Marsh and his Rebel deck. Escalon currently leads 2-1 and would like to end things here, but Marsh has stopped Escalon's basic strategy and forced him to come up with a plan B. Escalon's new aggressive plan looks like it just might work, but it all comes down to Marsh's next draw step.
If Marsh can draw Parallax Wave or Reverent Mantra, he can bust through for lethal damage. Otherwise, Escalon can probably hold on.
They're doing some upkeep clerical work. Escalon ports one of his lands. Should have basically no effect on the game, but might as well. He draws.
Was that a Plains?
Seal of Cleansing. Another one of those enchantment removal cards. That's not what he needed to draw. He promises to be a pretty complicated attack phase, but looks like Sigurd should be able to survive it. Yep, here comes everybody. He's doing what's called an alpha strike. Just attack with everyone. Sigurd will have to spend a little time thinking about what tricks Warren Marsh might have up his sleeve. Warren Marsh's main deck has Remosian rallies in it, which would allow all his creatures to get 1 point of power bigger.
You also might be watching the most amount of creatures ever on an attack in a constructed event. This is like a limited attack phase. It's going to take about another 90 seconds to figure out who's blocking who. You never see this kind of thing in constructed.
Sigurd lining up his blockers, counting carefully, making sure it doesn't take too much damage.
The two goals here are he doesn't want to lose to Ramosian Rally, and
It'd be unlikely for Marsh to have Ramosian Rally in his deck, but it's certainly something Eskelin has to worry about. He knows Marsh doesn't have a Reverent Mantra, or Marsh would already have cast it and won the game.
Correct.
Eskelin's hesitant to risk his barriers in combat, but he pretty much has to. So Eskelin lines up all the blockers he has access to. Looks like he's going to take, is that 2 points of damage?
So that'll be 2 that get through, but those are only 1 power creatures, so that would bring Eskelin to 5, but that's not enough.
Eskelin's pumping up his Drake Hatchling, so those Steadfast guards will actually die during this combat. It's not going to matter if Warren Marsh dies, but still the right thing to do. All right, Eskelin loses both of his Waterfront bouncers and takes 2 points of damage, down to 5. He's looking at Marsh. That's it, right? I'm gonna win? Disenchant your Eye of Ramos? Okay, ping you for 1? Yeah, Marsh was just hoping that Eskelin would make a mistake, and Eskelin was not gonna make a mistake at this level. That point of stinging barrier damage will drop Warren Marsh down to 3. Eskelin on taps. Shoot you for 3. There it is. Sigurd Eskelin. The Big Viking wins Pro Tour New York.
Okay, let's look back at the turning point of Game 4. With his back against the wall and his Rising Waters destroyed, Eskelin figures out to sacrifice his Eye of Ramos just to deal 1 extra point of damage. It turned out that he needed that extra point to defeat Marsh before he drowned under a sea of rebels.
Instead, it was Warren Marsh and his rebels who couldn't swim, and Sigurd Eskelin took home the title Pro Tour New York champion. Marsh has to settle for $15,000. Todd Harris is with our winner.
Sigurd Eskelin, you made a great run today. You made it all the way to the end. Are you surprised how well you've done?
Sort of, yeah, because I was sick for a week before coming here, so I haven't been able to practice as much as I wanted to. But the deck strategy suits me very well because it's a control style deck, and that's what I like to play. So
Making it this far certainly makes it worth the trip from Norway.
definitely it does. Yeah, it pays for my next rent too. So, and some more.
For Randy Bueller and Brian Hacker, I'm Todd Harris saying so long from New York City. This has been a presentation of ESPN, the worldwide leader in sports. For more, log on to ESPN.com, part of Go Network, go.com.